Hi, today I'd like to talk about something that I'm working on in my own writing practice. Hi, I'm Roz Carter. I'm an author, book coach, and editor, and I am talking about doing a retelling of a story that's in the public domain. The story I'm talking about is The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. And as you can see from my copy here, I have already gone through this short story and with my trusty legend for seeing what it is that I wanted to focus on, that I was pretty sure that the story also focused on. I have my legend, I have my flags, as you can see. And I went through this story. Well, let me back up. Okay. I am working on a personal challenge this year. I have a goal of writing one short story each month. And so I've written a story for the first month of the year. Now it's February and I haven't written a story yet. And I was listening to an Audible original of a retelling of Jekyll and Hyde, and they changed the protagonist to a female protagonist, and the story was really interesting. It was a modern retelling, and I enjoyed it, and it was short. It was, I think, maybe 2 hours on the Audible original. And so it's like, I haven't written my story for this month yet. Maybe I'll do a retelling. I haven't done that yet in my writing. So, because I'm mainly working in the Gothic genre, I thought of Poe, the master of Gothic stories and poems. So, The Telltale Heart was a short story that I read, obviously many times before, but also many years before. And I had an idea that it was different than how I read it this weekend. So I read the story once through and was like, this is actually really short. I don't know how many words. I would guess maybe 3,000, possibly 2,500 words. It's a very short story. Uh, so I read it through, and then I said, okay, there are definitely some themes here that I want to explore. But again, I haven't done a retelling before. So knowing that the story has to do with themes of obsession, and the the narrator is very unreliable. I knew that those were going to be two things that I flagged. I also figured that the atmosphere would also play a part in the tale. The setting is always very important. Another thing was the relationship that the narrator has with the man that he kills. Spoiler, if you haven't read it, it's about a murder. And so the thing that I wanted to pay attention to in my second reading of the story was, how did the narrator's guilt manifest throughout the story, and when did it switch? So the narrator, again, it's a very short story, but the narrator is unreliable basically from the very beginning. And there are some tells, I'll tell you how it happened. You'll see how and hear how healthy my mind is, right? Anybody that tells you right off the bat that they're not crazy, you know. So, so, but what was really interesting was how fast the obsession switched on in the story. And so, we're in the paragraph 3, and I already have it flagged twice that there are some obsessive thoughts creeping in, or obsessive actions coming in. So let me take this off. So that's literally on page one. By page two, you'll see that obsession is really at the forefront. This short story has gone completely obsessive at this point. Very little about the relationship between the man that is murdered and the narrator. The narrator is still, being unreliable in his proclamations. And again, the obsession is at the forefront by page two of this short story. Another thing that happens is the atmosphere, which isn't as pronounced as I remember it being, but he does, bring in the atmosphere a little bit, and it's mostly about the time of day. There aren't a lot of just of descriptions about the actual location. Where is this taking place? We know that, we see a room. We see that it's after midnight every night, and that's really pretty much it. We know it happens in a house. The man goes downstairs at the end when he opens the door. The narrator opens the door for the police, but the silence and the darkness, the cover of night, are really the two things that stand out as far as setting. And so that's where the Gothic atmosphere comes in this story. Another thing that comes in by page three, it's a little bit more with the manifestations of the narrator's guilt. It starts to come through. So you'll notice that I've flagged several points. So those are the blue flags. The pink is obsession. The blue are the guilty manifestations, and the orange is when the narrator is particularly uh, unreliable. And then this one is the now 4 o'clock in the morning, so that's atmosphere. So time of day really was how the atmosphere came in to play in this story. By the end of the story, we see that the narrator is identified a couple of times here. I identified lots of places where he was felt guilty, and how it manifested in the story, in the telling. And even at the end, that obsession still comes through, even into the last line. So went through it, flagged those things, and said, okay, this was, in its own right, obviously, it's a very good short story and holds up, even though I think it was written in 1843. So, it's got a couple hundred years on it now. Again, obviously, in the public domain. So, no fear there, or no concern there about doing a retelling of this story. And I thought to myself, okay, now what? Now what do I do with this story? What do I have to tell that is a retelling of the telltale heart that fits in with my writing? How can I adapt this? As I've mentioned before, one of my series is about a family of witches. And these witches, there are two teenage witches in my family at this point in the story world. uh, and they are sent to a witch academy to learn how to be better witches, right? And that's in a story that I wrote a couple of years ago. And then I did a follow up to that story from the one. The first story was about the first teenager that we follow. And then the second story was a follow up talking about another one of the teenagers in the story. So I have established that they attend Black Isis Witch Academy in my story universe. I immediately thought about using one of their instructors at the school as the protagonist for this short story retelling. And having the location be the school grounds, because their school is set in the Great Dismal Swamp, the area of the swamp that is located in North Carolina. And so they're in a very isolated area. The school grounds are on an isolated area already. And so I said, okay, if the teacher is in this isolated area, that gives me some of that atmosphere that I want for the Gothic atmosphere. I can play with obsession, obviously. I can play with how the teacher has the manifestations of guilt in the story that I didn't think I would have a problem with that. And so the only thing that I had left was to think about if I'm following that same pattern, that same framework from that I identified in the Telltale Heart, were the relationship, right? Who does she kill? Because I knew that the teacher was going to kill someone. I knew this protagonist was going to kill someone, and because I have a cast of characters already from my story universe, uh, I needed to pick which character it would be, which teacher it would be. So I picked one of the teachers that I'd already previously identified as a married teacher. And so, boom, I have my relationship. Okay, she's going to kill her husband. Great. So, obsession, I have my narrator who I will make unreliable. Um, and there are a couple of ways that I can do that with language and how I tell the story. I knew almost immediately that I would tell the story in first person because that's how the original is told from the narrator's viewpoint. And I knew the atmosphere. Again, I'm looking at my notes. Knew the relationship finally, and I knew I knew that I could bring in her guilt and how it would show in the story. So that's the plan for how I'm going to retell the Telltale Heart. And so the next step was, you're probably thinking, well, you write the outline for the short story. Not exactly. I love outlines and I will do an outline for this story because I think that it's the best way to make sure that you stay on track and that your story, actually hits all of the proper plot points. But I wasn't ready to do an outline just yet. I needed to tell the story to myself first. I wanted to make sure that it was different enough from the original, that I was telling the story from this character's viewpoint, and that I had those elements that I wanted to include even in a first telling. Okay. So this is what I consider as my first draft, but I call it a zero draft. In the zero draft, this is what I do. I try to make time so that I can sit down and do a zero draft in one shot. In one sitting, I just sit and usually handwrite the entire story as it's in my mind from start to finish. It usually ends up being fairly short, so think of it as like a long synopsis. For a short story, it ended up being 2 pages, almost 2 pages longhand. And so, again, I sat down and wrote the story as it's come to me based on the telltale heart. And I can actually read it because I think that it's important to see where my thinking is in the story so far. And then I can talk about, after I read through this, then I can talk about exactly what I'm going to do next for this story. The Telltale Heart retelling. I don't have a new title for this yet. Uh, Lynette is a well respected teacher at Black Isis Academy. By day, she teaches her students, and by night, she must endure the incessant clicking of her husband's jaw. The constant clicking isn't helped by any of her attempts, teas, spells, rituals. Nothing is working. As the sound increases in intensity over 7 days, on the eighth day, Lynette snaps and kills her husband. Spending one night in the blissfully quiet house with his body still sitting in his once favorite armchair, Lynette rests until the sound of his beating heart awakens her from slumber. Once awakened, in a panic, Lynette dismembers the body, saving the heart for her crow companions who visit her each morning. Working in the dead of night, one without a moon to illuminate her movements, Lynette buries the parts of her husband's body in the wooded area on the school grounds. The woods are silent except Lynette can still hear his heart beating. Back at their cottage, Lynette chops his heart up to feed to her crow friends. Their treat is waiting for them, as is Lynette, who sits on the porch awaiting the sunrise. She can still hear the beating of his heart, but the sound seems fainter outside than in the house, which is strange to Lynette since she's keeping her eye on the dish which is holding his heart. She doesn't have to wait long before her companions come to enjoy their fleshy treat. Before long, the cawing of their murder is filling the air. So thunderous is the cawing of the crows that it almost drowns out the sound of the beating heart. When the other teachers come to inquire about the noise from the crows, Lynette is still sitting on her porch, rocking slowly, a slight smile on her lips and frown creasing her brow. One of her colleagues, Eleanor, whose husband's jaw never offended her, asked what's happening. Lynette is happy to share that she's just given her companions a special treat this morning. She offers her colleagues coffee or tea, although she's reluctant to re enter the house, knowing that the sound is much louder inside. Mina, one of the new faculty members, accepts her offer, and Lynette goes inside, briefly covering her ears as she passes her husband's recliner. When Mina asks whose blood is on the machete, Lynette tells her. She is calm, so calm, although she is covered in the dried blood of her husband. She's just noticed that. She'd like to clean up, take a nice long shower. The kettle is whistling. She's trying to tell everyone gathered in her small living room that she'll be right with them. She just wants to clean up a bit before class. But the heart is beating so loud, and now they've surrounded her. And look, now they're all outside. Her crow friends are mostly gone. So is most of the heart. One of her crow friends is sitting on a low branch of the birch on her path. She and her crow friend exchange a glance as she's rushed down the path. She can hear the heart beating. It's coming from the crow. Okay, so that's my zero draft of the story. There is so much more work to do for this story, but I think I know now more about how I want to proceed with this short story retelling. My question to you is, have you ever done a retelling, maybe a fairy tale retelling? I know those were popular, especially a couple of years ago. Or do you have plans to do a retelling in the future? If so, leave a comment. I'd love to hear your plans or what you've done in the past. Um, Also, if you'd like to, follow me on this challenge and participate yourself, the challenge is simple and really open ended. It really is just write one short story per month. We're doing it every month in this year, 2025. So if you're in for the challenge, let me know in the comments. I can't wait to see how we all progress. And I will come back later on as I work on this month's story. So again, that's my quick zero draft of the retelling for The Telltale Heart. I will see you soon. Remember, done beats perfect. Let's write.